Okay, we're doing some more world building today, and let's start with making some terrain. But first, I'm making a design, so let's talk first about how to make terrain that fits into your world. So last time we talked about, that's birds. You can hear the birds on my roof. Last time we talked about research and finding inspiration, and that kind of helps you put down a vibe. But what also helps you put down a vibe is color. To keep all my terrain and all my miniatures in kind of the same realm of existence, I like to think about a color scheme. So I took one of my images that I put on my inspiration board, so I'm gonna use that as like a base to base my color scheme on. I feel like a lot of worlds that you already know have a familiar color scheme. A moody urban fantasy setting will have a lot of grays, blues and pale yellows, but if you want to go for like a lush jungle setting with mysterious ruins and dinosaurs, you'll go for greens, browns and sandstone. And if you're taking it to a scorching desert planet, you'll have a lot of oranges, browns, yellows, that kind of stuff. Unless you're going for a Feywild look with some saturated purples, yellows, greens, blues. You get it. My other tip that I have is choose constraints. This might be difficult because I find it very difficult. For role-playing games, I like to give my players a lot of creative freedom. If they want to be a mermaid, I want to let them be a mermaid. But sometimes it's kind of good to put some constraints because it enriches the world and it also gives some direction. Like for a lot of people it can be very scary and maybe uninspiring to just get a blank map and you telling them they can be anything they can imagine. And what also might be fun is if you have some lore or secrets to kind of put that into your terrain building as well, because that can really help you add to the visual story that you're making. I have this idea of making some stones with faces on them that are spirits of people who got lost in the Hazelands. It's kind of inspired by some historical Irish sculptures, carvings. Here's a picture of what I'm talking about. I wanted to make designs kind of based on that and hide them around my world, so I'm hoping that tells more about the story of this world. Okay, I thought of one other tip. So tip number 4, I guess. I've studied film and animation, and visual themes is something very important in designing. And visual themes can be anything from snail shells, doorways, clocks, skulls, or whatever. If you pick like maybe 2 or 3 recurring visual themes that you can incorporate into your terrain, it will really show a lot of story in your terrain and make your world very memorable and recognizable. But you can also tie it to some factions so that people may start to recognize whose domain this might be. So anyway, let's start designing. I have this big square of foam that I'm going to use as a base. I'm hoping to make a pretty versatile piece of terrain, so it'll be a path, because who knows what can happen on a pathway. Then I thought it might be cool to have some kind of waterfall, a little pond full of secrets being filled by a spring coming out of a face-shaped sculpture in the rocks. Oh, and last time I gave you a little multiple choice story and you guys voted for going through the stone gate, so we can't forget to add that. We'll have to add some trees to make this into a moody forest scene, and the rocks with faces scattered alongside the path. This won't be a very modular piece of terrain, but it mainly needs to set the scene. This thing I've been desperately wanting to build is something between a creature and a piece of terrain. I've been writing this story about a king whose castle ran away. More about that in a bit, but we're building this tower. So I got this neglected baby from the secondhand store and a jar that I thought would be a great start to my build. I cut it up in a way that it would fit together and then tried to make it somewhat stable with a reinforced skewer that I put through the whole thing. I know the skewer thing looks a bit weird, I don't know what I was thinking, but it worked. I wasn't sure what size base to use, but I ended up going for the big one. I needed to compensate the top heaviness of the whole build, so I glued a rock to the base that I could insert the skewer in for extra stability. This seems like a great time to tell you the story of this tower. Once upon a time, there was a king who wanted to live in a castle, because that's what kings do. He asked the gnomes to build it for him, which they would do on one condition alone. He wasn't allowed to look while they were building. The king made his promise and they started the work. The building took months, and eventually curiosity got the better of the king, and he looked without anyone noticing. Or so he thought. When the castle finished, the king held a grand feast, which was a good excuse to boast about his magnificent castle. However, during a drunken contest of hopscotch, the king challenged one of the gnomes. Just when the king thought he was getting the upper hand, the gnome flicked his fingers and the whole castle grew legs and hopped away. Towers and halls, pillars and all, scattered across the land. The king was devastated, and to this day, he is still trying to get his castle back together. While that dried, I started working on the actual terrain piece. I used a 1-inch base to get a sense of scale because I always mess up there. Drawing it straight on the foam helped me visualize the whole thing pretty well, although I drew way too many trees. I then used some spare foam to make the hills, and cut out the pond pretty shallowly so I didn't have to use that much silicone. Here's the little face that will be continuously puking out water. He's made of some light air dry clay and looks like he's singing a beautiful song. I would have liked to have the waterfall a bit less rectangular, cubey shaped, but I used some thin foam scraps to give it a nice cobbled look. I then used the cobble to give everything a more rocky look, with honestly moderate results. So I threw together a mixture of sand and PVA glue to give it a real muddy look. This was actually so fun to do, and I tried to give the path a little bit of a different texture from the rest of the ground to make it look like an actual path. It looks really bad now, but I promise that painting does a lot of the heavy lifting. This is where we're at right now. I made 2 tiny rocks. This is not everything. I made this base. It has like a path and this thing that hopefully will be a waterfall. Then I also made this. It still needs some work, but I like where it's going. I found this roll of strip foam in my dad's carpentry stuff. I don't know what it actually is used for, but it worked great for detailing. I made some windows that I'm planning to keep unpainted so the light can shine through. With a file, I could easily make a beautiful brick pattern and then just stick it on. It's sticky on one side and foam on the other, so I could just stick strips of it on my tower and then texture it either like planks or bricks, which was such a nice discovery. I then cut out a piece of paper that I could stick some planks on to give the inside of the tower a nice wooden floor. This tower needed to look a lot more crusty though, so I added some of Bill Making Stuff's original crustard recipe as a way of mimicking loam walls. The roof was starting to look a little bit boring now, and I find the best way to make shingles is to cut strips of cereal boxes and cut it into irregular pieces. After the detailing was done, it was ready to be painted. This barren land needed to be converted into a lush landscape. The gate through which our lost travelers will enter was made from some aluminium foil, and at this point my best friend air dry clay. Yeah, I think that looks good. There are many gateways into the Hazelands, but the stone gate is considered one of the front doors. I just checked my last video, and at this point more people voted for the demon door, so I'll be making that one in another video. This gateway had some ancient carvings based on Pictish symbols and tiny paper talisman. Okay, now for painting my terrain. I used the color scheme I decided beforehand as a reference. Lots of ochres and grey browns. Okay, I feel like I'm at that stage where I often get at, where I'm really unsure about the colors and I struggle with it a bit and I overdo it loads of times. But there is one thing that I thought of that I'm gonna be sure of. I wanna add a little fairytale something. Let me look at my bits box. A sword. I wanted to add a little sword in the middle of the lake. Because I thought that would be a cute fairytale moment. I do think flocking will change the whole vibe. And that is what I'm hoping for. The water effect was made with some kind of crystal clear silicone glue. I thinned it out with a bit of isopropyl alcohol to make it easier to smooth out. While it was a bit drier, I could really shape it and add some cool water texture. I tried to make some rings around the stream so it looks like the spring is shaping the surface. Lastly, I needed to make a forest. I found that snipping pieces of dead hedge from my neighbor's garden was the best tree shape I could find. I had blended and dyed mattress foam to make foliage and applied that to the branches, which was a lot more challenging than I had hoped. It didn't stick well, but finally with much PVA and spray glue I ended up with some cute looking trees. I drilled little holes at the bottoms of the trees and glued a piece of wire into it so I could easily push them into the foam. It took a bunch of hot glue, but I ended up with a small forest in the end. I knew Flock would change the whole thing, but I splashed a little bit of green paint as well to make sure I was getting the good lush look that I wanted. I used some small sawdust Flock and just covered most of the dirt. And then finally, it was finished. Alright, it's finally finished. This took me a pretty long time because I've been doing a lot of different projects at the same time as usual. But I really like how this turned out and I'm really excited to play a game on this and I hope to share that soon. It's my first time trying out water effects and I feel like that went pretty well. And I'm really happy with how this tower turned out. And it's vacuum sealed, so you can keep your veggies fresh in this walking tower. I feel like it's also a great way to transport some minis or whatever. And then, last but not least, I made this little gate. I actually dropped it, and it made some beautiful cracks, and I just filled those up with moss. And I think it has a great natural effect, and I feel like the moss is where the moss would be. Thank you for watching. And I'll see you in the next one.